And welcome back as we go ahead and get ready to add into our game UI. Now, of course, as we go into this, there's good things to do as we kind of think about. For example, if you haven't revisited your game design document and updated it with some of the things we've done so far, I'd recommend you do that. Add in things like your version histories to things like talk about how you have the player ability to shoot, you have the enemy shooting, you have enemy death, things like that. Add those into your version history. But now we, of course, are doing a major update. We, of course, have to work on creating our game UI. But before we actually start popping elements in, let's do a little bit of planning. And that planning entails what should our UI contain. Now, first thing to think about is, of course, health elements. And this is, of course, tying back to the health script. We could have this displayed numeric or visually. I think we're going to approach it more from a visual perspective this time. What to do, for example, if our health gets low. Should we change our player sprite? This could be something that we could explore. Or could even do things like maybe changing enemy behavior, or if they get damaged, they could have a different sprite, they could start strobing, maybe their rate of fire changes, all sorts of things that we can do when we start thinking about how this UI starts affecting our world. Of course, we're also going to have some kind of score, which obviously is probably going to be a text element that we're going to add into our game. And there are, of course, other items that we could consider as well should we want to continue to enhance our game. For example, we could keep track of the current wave ID. So, for example, let's say a certain level has 5 waves, and you're on wave 2 of 5, we can, of course, have that information. Maybe you have power-ups for your game, and you want to record or have those out there in the game world so the player can use them. And lastly, maybe you have a thing like total playtime. If you have, for example, infinite waves, they just keep going until the end of time, maybe you can have how long have you been playing this game. So to get started with our game, let's go ahead and add in a canvas element. So we'll go UI and we'll add in canvas. And it's going to, of course, add in also an event system. And if you see this error here that says replace with input system, we're going to go ahead and click that. We're going to head back to our canvas, and the next thing we want to do is actually add in a panel element. This is going to allow us to put in that first piece here. Now, if I double click on this, it may be larger than what I have in my actual game world. Because if you go to my canvas here, one of the things I need to do is change my scaler here. And right now I'm set to constant pixel size. I actually want to scale this with screen size because remember, we didn't set this up with pixels. We set this up with an aspect ratio. So I'm going to set this to 1080 by 1920 because that's going to allow it to kind of follow that full HD resolution. And so now if I go back to my panel, one of the things I want to do is I want to make sure that this is scaled appropriately. And just to kind of illustrate this, I'm actually going to delete it real quick here. I'm going to show you that you can see where it was. It was this huge element, so I'm going to add that back in. That panel, we don't want it necessarily so large because we only want it really to kind of be here at the bottom because we're going to use it to constrain some of our elements. So to do that, we can, of course, just drag this down here just to kind of get us started. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in here, and of course I can use different pieces in here. I can use my anchor presets, for example, to put some of these in here. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually manually put in some of these values here. And I'm going to say that the maximum anchor is going to be at 0.1, so 1/10 of that screen. And with those in place, you can see it now is only taking up this bottom portion. I think that looks pretty good for that panel element. The next thing we're going to want to do, of course, is start adding in, for example, our health slider. So let's go to my panel again. I'm going to go to UI, and I'm going to make a slider. And let's just call this our health slider. And what we want to do with this one, I'm going to actually zoom in just a little bit here. And I want to take and break this apart so that way having that health only be on this half of the screen. So right here in the middle, I have my anchors. I'm going to grab these two here. I'm going to pull those over. I'm going to take it so it's to the top of both sides and to the bottom. And I only want that to be about 50%. And you notice if I click on that, I can see it's right at 50% because I want to constrain that to this panel here, but I don't want it taking up the full thing. Next, let's adjust this slider so it's a little bit more off. Instead of being here in the center, we want it in the center of this element here. So we're just going to reset the rect transform to all 0 values. And you can see it's now kind of occupying here. But I want to add a little bit of buffer. I don't want it right up against the edge of my screen. So let's just add about a 25 pixel border. That should be at least enough to kind of get us started. We can always adjust it from there if we determine we want something else. Now, there's a couple things in the actual slider mechanism that we're going to do. Uninteractable, we want off because we don't want the player to drag that around. So we're going to also change our color tint to none. We don't need any of those features there. And our value, let's go ahead and bump that to 0.5 just so we can have a little bit of elements here when we actually start adding color and stuff like that to it. Now if we open up the health slider, you'll see it has a couple different things. We have a background, a fill area, handle slider. We don't need the handle slide at all on this, and so there's a couple ways you can delete it right out, or you can simply just uncheck that and it will disable that as an active element within the health slider. Now we're ready to add some text, so click back on panel and right click on this and do UI, and let's go ahead and add in our Text Mesh Pro. All right, if you get, of course, the import window, let's go ahead and click on that to bring those information in that we need. We want the essentials here. Extras and examples I'm not as worried about, so I can just go ahead and close that there. So this one is, of course, going to occupy the other side of our screen, so we're going to, again, grab these anchors, and let's go ahead and bring them so they're filling up the screen here. Again, we can look to see it should be right around 50% that we, of course, are taking up here. If we look at our rect transform, we're going to pretty much do the exact same thing as we did before. We want to have that padding value on here. So let's just go ahead and add a 25 on the left and right and set our bottom and top to 0. Now with this, because we're trying to scale it, we got to do a couple editing here to our Text Mesh Pro. The first is, instead of setting a fixed font size, let's set to auto size. And you can adjust this auto size option as much as you want. I'm going to set the minimum to 12. I'll leave the max at 72. That sounds good here. And because we are kind of trying to do a little bit more centered here, let's go ahead and center that font and bring it down into the center as well. You, of course, can choose your own reference. So, for example, you want on the right, you can do it on the right. But I think putting it here will be fine just to start. And just so we don't see the new text, let's just go ahead and set in, I'm just going to set 999 in here just so that way we have a reference here with this core text. Obviously, this is not going to stay here because we're going to actually update this once we start adding score into our game. All right, and so now I'm going to leave you with a little bit of a challenge. A couple things we want to do, of course, is update this health slider so it's not just this plain white bar that we have right now. I want you to go ahead and see if you can figure out how can we update this health slider. Remember, you do have other elements here to go ahead and take a look at there. And also our Text Mesh Pro. Let's see if we can replace this plain, boring text here with something that might be more exciting. In fact, I can even add a couple other digits in here if I want to really kind of space out a little bit, see a little bit more detail. So again, go ahead and do that, and let's see what you come up with. And you can see I went ahead and chose my own color variations and my own font. And so you, of course, can play around with your own options, finding the color choices that are most desired for you. But I think this is a good start for us to go ahead and do different things here in our game. And again, you can play around with this, and I might even come in later and play around with this more to find the color choices and stuff that I want. And with my text here, of course, I have this kind of just plain, boring white. We, of course, can do additional options. Don't forget, you can come in here and change different things here to really kind of make that text pop out. I think we're going to go ahead and play around with mine a little bit more off camera, but let's go ahead and see what you come up with, and I hope that you're satisfied with this first step of our UI.